Hello. So this Parshat Yitro, we're going to talk a little bit about Yitro. Surprise, surprise. The beginning of the Parsha tells us about how Yitro, who is Moshe's father-in-law, comes to meet Moshe after the days of the war with Amalek, soon after the time that the Jews leave Egypt, and he basically brings Moshe's family, who Moshe had to leave with Yitro during the time that he went to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. And during this period, he also gives Moshe some advice about how to manage some judicial affairs with Israel. And then we stop hearing about Yitro until much later, when they finally get closer to Israel, and Yitro says, "Well, I can't go on from here on." And Moshe tells him, "No, please come with us. You'll be part of us." And when we get there, perhaps we'll talk about that story. But for now, this is really the second time we've heard about Yitro. The first round of hearing about Yitro was when Moshe is running away from Egypt after killing an Egyptian and discovering that people know that he is the one who killed the Egyptian. And then he comes to a well, and he finds, in Parshat Shemot, Yitro's daughters struggling with some men who are bothering them near the water hole. And after saving them from these men, Yitro calls him over and says, let's. He takes him in, basically. He makes him into a shepherd, and he also marries him off his daughter. And so now, after Moshe comes back, after leaving Egypt, now Yitro rejoins him and says, well, now the danger is over, now we can be together, and supposedly continues with him until Sefer Bamidbar, where we hear again of Yitro's dilemma, if he should continue with the Jews or not. Now, there's a lot of things that happen, there's a lot of Midrashim that explain what happened with Yitro, because the Parsha begins with Vayishma. Yitro, Kohen Midyan Choten Moshe, et kol asher asa Elohim leMoshe uleYisrael amo, ki yotzi Adonai et Yisrael miMitzrayim. So Yitro hears all the things that have occurred, and then he comes to Israel and to the people of Israel and joins them. And so the Midrash tries to understand what exactly he heard. What was it that he heard? What process, what sort of thinking process went through his mind that led him to come? Because it sounds like he heard and then he came. And there's all sorts of opinions exactly of what went on there. As we'll see, many of the Midrashim really are sort of drawing upon Yitro's background. Yitro's background as a Kohen Midyan. That's how he's described. Vayishma Yitro, Kohen Midyan, a priest of Midyan, so not a believer in God, hears about these events and comes. And during this meeting, he says to Moshe, "Ata yadati ki gadol Adonai mikol haElohim, ki v'davar asher zadu alehem." So now I know that God is the greatest of all gods. So you have here this priest, who's announcing that God is the one true God, or the greatest God at least. And I think that many of the Midrashim, some of which we'll talk about today, are sort of focusing on that. But before we go into that aspect, I want to sort of take off from Midrash. This is a Midrash that appears also in Midrash Raba, also in Midrash Tanchuma, who apparently share a lot of their texts. And I'll read the one from Midrash Raba, but you can find it also in Tanchuma. So again, what did he hear? Davar acher vayishma Yitro. Hadao dichtiv shalach lachmecha al pnei hamayim ki berov hayom timtzaenu. So it's quoting a verse from Kohelet that says you should send your bread upon the water because one day you'll find the bread. So what does this mean? Why would anybody put bread on water? The bread is going to get destroyed. So obviously Shlomo, when he said this in Kohelet, didn't intend for you to actually take bread and put it on water. It's obviously some sort of a parable or some message is embedded in this. ועל מי אמר? על יתרו שנתן לחמו למשה, שנאמר כי ראין לו ויאכל לחם. So, what is this referring to? Shlomo was not talking about really putting bread on water. He was actually just he was trying to hint towards the story of Yitro and Moshe, where Yitro gave bread to Moshe when his daughters came back and said that Moshe had saved them. He called back and said, Kira'en lo v'yochal lechem. In other words, bring him back and let him eat bread. And zem al pnei hamayim zem Moshe shene'emar ki min hamayim meshitiyu. So the water here, so you give the bread to the water. So why is Moshe water? So Moshe is water because he himself was on the water, right? When he was a baby in his basket, he was put on the water, and Miriam, his sister, watched over him until the Bat Paro came and picked him up. ולמה? כי ברוב הימים תמצאנו ויבוא אהרון וכל זקני ישראל לאכול לחם. So when will you find your bread? You find your bread here. Because here too, Aharon, the verses end at the end of the first section of reading in the Parsha, at the end of Rishon, we read the verse, ויבוא אהרון וכל זקני ישראל לאכול לחם עם חותן משה לפני האלוהים. So it says that they took Aharon and all the zikanim, all the elders of Israel, came with Moshe and Yitro to eat together before God. So here you see, he gave bread to Moshe, and now he's getting that bread back several years later. This is the idea of send your bread on the water, one day you'll find it. Okay, so in other words, he spit the bread, he got it back, everything, the scales are even. Now, as always, we by now I don't need to say this, that we don't take these things at face value. In other words, we understand that the message here is, if you take risks, in certain points, one day you will reap the benefits. But naturally, there's something more that's going on over here. And obviously, what's going on is that the Midrash is asking us to compare those two stories. In other words, take a look at what happened with Moshe and Yitro back then. Take a look at what's happening now with Yitro and Moshe, and derive some lesson that has to do with the things that you do back then somehow affect you today. To answer the question of what exactly it is that the Midrash is trying to tell us, I think we need to first realize that Yitro is unique in the Torah, in that he is one of the only converts that we know about in the Torah. You might say that he's the only convert that we know about, as a convert in the regular sense of a person that we know who left where he was and joined Israel. The other two figures which you can put in that category that I can think of right now are Avraham, who of course changed his belief. He started off in a family of non-believers, of idol worshippers, and moved on to being a believer in Hashem and begin the people of Israel. And then there's Rachav, who later on in the Sefer Yoshua, we hear about her that she sort of got was sort of believed that Hashem was what he was. It's not clear what she did with that afterwards. According to the Midrash, she married Yoshua. So, and then there's a few others which appear in the Midrash, like Bat Paro, and I'm sure that we have some in Melachim, which we can determine that they were Gerim on some level, Uyachiti, Doeg Edomi, all these people that might or might not have been Gerim. But the ones that are emphasized the most, because we know the most about their spiritual journey, are Avraham and Yitro. And there are many similarities, right? They both had to leave where they were in order to be part of God's people. But there are also many differences. And one of the main differences is that Avraham, we don't know from the verses what Avraham's dilemmas were, what kind of challenges he went through until he reached that belief. But the Midrash paints a very clear picture of a young man who from very early on has doubts about what to believe in. He's constantly in search, constantly looking for things to believe in, until he finally settles on belief in God. This is not Yitro. Yitro is Kohen Midian. He is a priest of Midian. So he already has taken his belief very seriously, just like Avraham. He takes his belief seriously, but he's settled on some belief, and within that belief, okay, he has built himself an entire life. Not like Avraham, who, even if he had lived for a long time before he decided, when he was 40, to change beliefs, to change religions, Avraham never built his career around that religion. But Yitro did. Yitro was a priest. His entire life surrounded this idea that he was a priest of Midian, and that was his service. Very interestingly, Chazal actually draw a parallel between Yitro on the one hand and Bil'am. Bil'am, who in the book of Bamidbar is called upon by Moab and others as well, and Ziknei Midian, to come and curse Israel because of his great powers as a wizard or a sorcerer or a prophet or whatever you want to call it. Bil'am and the Chazal in many places take Bil'am and Yitro, and they say here were two people that saw what happened in Egypt, that started off as believers in idols or in other forces, and were shown the truth, and look at the different decisions that they made, right? Because Bil'am, even though he knew the truth, and we know that he knew the truth because he has all these discussions with God, and during those discussions, it's clear that he understands that God is the one who determines things. He still won't give up. He still won't give in and won't convert. He won't move over and say, I'm going to follow where the truth is. But Yitro does. Yitro, by doing that, had to give up everything that he was worth, right? He has to give up his position. He has to forget about this whole life that he's built around himself and follow what he believes to be truth. So really, if we now look at the parallel that Chazal are drawing, right? They're saying, look what happened. Back in the day, when Yitro took in Moshe, what was the situation? What were we looking at there? We had Yitro, a person with a solid career, with considerable personal standing, taking in a person who is nothing in his land. He has no family. He has no friends. He's wanted by the Pharaoh. Okay, so and he goes and he takes him in. And now look how the tides have turned, because now not only is Moshe the great priest, right? He is now the great priest. He's what Yitro was when he was taken in. Yeah, Moshe is what? Moshe is the great priest. Yitro is nothing. Yitro is not leaving his position as Kohen Midian to become Kohen Israel. He doesn't have that ability to do that. He doesn't have that right. He's not in the level that Moshe is, or anywhere close to him, that he can come along and say, I am going to now be a priest to some other god. It's not going to work. He's moving from being a priest to being a nobody, to being just another guy. That's the greatness of Yitro. Unlike Avraham, who made a shift from being, he had to tear away from his family, but he never had to tear away from his identity. His identity was always in flux. He was always trying to figure out who he was, until the point where he settled on his belief. Yitro, that wasn't the situation. Yitro knew what he was, and when the moment came that he was shown what he should become, what he should be, what the truth was, he, unlike Bil'am, made that move. He made that move and became something new, even though that something new, from a social standpoint, was nothing. And that's the greatness of it. Now that we understand that sort of how the tides have, not the tides have turned, but how the positions were reversed. How before Moshe, who was nothing, who was helpless, just like when he was sent on the river. That's, I think, part of why the Midrash is bringing that. Because also then he was hopeless. He was helpless. There was nothing he could do. He was saved by a miracle. Here too, Moshe was saved by a miracle called Yitro. And now Yitro is taken in by Moshe. think there's another aspect of it. There's a concept in tzedakah that there's a concept in tzedakah that talks about that when you're trying to give tzedakah to somebody, it's more important that you restore his honor, his self-respect, his self-esteem, than that you give him money. So let's say you can give somebody money, or you can pay for a ride on a very prestigious carriage while he's wearing a suit. Okay? If this was a rich guy before he became destitute, then you should do the second thing, because what you want to do is give a person back his pride, give a person back his self-esteem, make him feel like he is what he used to be, and he can still become that. And I think that's part of what the meaning is of this eating bread over here. Back in the time when Moshe was, looking for, was wandering around, he wasn't lacking personal standing. He obviously lost that when he left the Egyptians, but that really wasn't the thing that he was missing. He just had nowhere to go. He needed bread. He needed assistance. He needed a place to stay. Yitro bringing him in, giving him bread, was basically taking him into his house. Yitro doesn't need that. True, he probably lost his community. He might even be considered a trader, and in that sense, need help. But the real thing that Yitro lost was his personal position. And now, with that in mind, think about what happened here. It wasn't just that he was given bread. What does it say? Moshe came and gave him some bread, and he ate some bread. What does it say? It says, "Vayavo Aharon v'chol ziknei Yisrael le'echol lechem im choten Moshe lifnei ha'Elohim." Aharon and all the wise men of Israel, all the elders, came to eat with Yitro before God. What do you have over here? You have basically an acceptance of Yitro, at least for this moment, into the elite, and saying, sure, you can't fit in, you don't have a position here right now, but we're going to give you the same respect that you deserve. We'll give you what you need in order to feel like you're worth something. You must feel now that you've wasted your life, that you've been everywhere. Chazal say that, Yitro says, "Ata yadati ki gadol Hashem mikol ha'elohim." I know now that God is greater than all the gods. And Chazal say, most people say that, you don't know if they know what they're talking about. Yitro knew what he was talking about. He worshipped everything. He had gone through it all. Even when he was a priest of Midian, he can still worship all the other, you can worship many gods while you're a priest from Midian. So Yitro knew what he was talking about, okay? And now he discovered that his entire life was a lie. That it was nothing. And he comes to the people who so-called know the truth, who uphold that truth, and he could only expect to be treated as a nobody, maybe even worse for his past behavior. And they take him in, and they bring him to eat bread before God with all the spiritual elite of the people. That is the true sort of meaning of his getting, that bread back. In that it wasn't just that he got bread. It wasn't only that he was taken in to the people of Israel and given a place to be and to live. He was also recognized for his spiritual honesty by being put in a position where he could sort of associate with the elite, even though he could have been easily just cast aside and treated like a nobody. And so I think, to summarize, the Midrash here, by drawing this parallel, is showing us not only how fickle life is, how you think you know something and you can also change later on. It's also showing how, if you're honest, I think, if you're truly honest with yourself, if you do what you really believe is right, in the end, that will be recognized, and that recognition won't be something of no value. It will really be meaningful to the point that you can restore even your self-respect, even your self-esteem. And I think it also is trying to make us realize, and a lot of these Midrashim are trying to make us realize that difference between Yitro and Avraham, of how Yitro, even though they're both converts, even though they both had to go through a painful process, Yitro's conversion, in some sense, had a bigger price tag on it, because he might not have had to leave his family like Avraham did, which is also a difficult thing. But he had built something. He had become something he had made. Your family is something you don't choose. It's true you want to be in touch with them. And I'm sure Avraham suffered greatly by having to leave them if his relationship was really good with them, which we don't really know. But Yitro had made something of himself. He had a story that he had told about himself, and he had to basically erase that story and rewrite it all from scratch. Being able to do that, is truly like something that conversion and later in life I think is all about. The Midrash here is trying to sort of show you not only how that can happen, but also when that happens, how do you treat that convert, or what is the way to do that? What is the appropriate way to take him in, and how, if that convert was honest earlier in their lives, then they'll deserve that and get what they deserve there. Shabbat Shalom.